turn off, so she's going to be. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our speaker series. This is a great problem to have to switch to a bigger space. I love this problem. I've been the executive director here at the Kansas Oil Museum for 11 months now, almost a year. And this is the first time we've had this problem. So we're moving in the right direction. A lot of fun things that are going on at the museum. We have our monthly speaker series. That is the third Thursday of every month. We have our children's theater, which is in the fall and in the spring. We have our monthly coffee and collections, which we look at artifacts in our collections that are not currently on display. We have a lot of really cool things going on here at the museum. If you would like to support the things that are going on at the museum and help us continue to grow, becoming a member of the museum is a great way to do that. Becoming a member not only benefits you with free admissions to our museum, discounted ticket prices to events, it also benefits us and helps us continue to grow our education programs and to preserve the artifacts and the exhibits that we have. If you are already a member and you would like to take it a step further, there we also have what is called our Tower Club. It's spelled tour. That is because somebody gave a bunch of oil field guys permission to make a name for something, and they came up with that name as their Tower Shift, spelled T-O-U-R. And that is the shift that they would have when they were on site for 24 hours working the drill rigs. So we've adopted that term for our education programming, and we have our Tower. I keep wanting to say tour. It's the English teacher in me. We have our Tower Club. That is a monthly donation. We are looking for our first 4 people of $25 a month to support that, and it goes directly towards our education programs. If you would like information on some of the tables, there are some QR codes that you can scan and go to the page to learn more about that. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for our speaker series this May, Denise Busenitz. Did I say that right? Yes. Denise was also the winner of our 2020 Jesse Perry Stratford writing contest. That is a contest that we do annually. We actually plan on expanding that contest. Right now it is for 16 and up. It is a minimum of a 3,000 word research paper over Butler County. We are going to expand that and really focus on including schools within the county by adding additional writing prompts, whether it's poetry, flash fiction. So we plan on introducing that in the fall and putting it out to our schools and to homeschools and to the local community to really build that writing program. Welcome, Denise.
Okay, how many of you guys have seen the signs the Cherokee Trail crossed here? Are you familiar with those signs? Okay, so some of you, maybe more out in our area. How many of you are familiar with the trail the Cherokee Trail that came through here? You know a little bit of the story behind it. Okay, so a lot of you are not really that familiar with it. Okay, well, I first became aware of this trail about 12, 13 years ago. One of our sons had been out in a pasture northeast of us, and he had seen what looked like wagon ruts. And so he came back and he said, Mom, you know, of course, he knew I love history. My favorite time is the time of the settlers, the time of the trails. And so he came in and says, Mom, what do you know about a trail that came through here? And I had to admit, I knew absolutely nothing. So there were a couple of local historians, my go-to people, and I made a few phone calls, and I was given the name of the Cherokee Trail. Interestingly, just a few years prior to this, these have been published by Pat and Jack Fletcher. They did an incredible amount of work. They researched the trail from Fort Smith all the way to California. They got in touch with the local historical groups along the way. They had obtained copies of original diaries, first of the first group that blazed the trail, and then in the later years there were other people who kept good diaries. And so they published these, and they included the GLO map. These are the government land office maps, and just put together a lot of good information. So those books, good resources. Another one, and I didn't think to ask, but I think this book is still available in the gift shop. It's Augusta's Journal. Augusta was the daughter of one of the founders of the original El Dorado. This was established actually at the crossing of the Walnut, where the refinery is now. This book is a treasure. It does give a lot of information. A lot of the names that you'll see in the book, you will also see on the maps today. The names of the creeks, some of the names of the streets here in town. One of the things as a historian that's disappointing to me is Marjorie Crump and her husband are the ones that published this. She is a descendant of Augusta. I'm assuming to make it more, maybe have a wider audience, they fictionalized it. They kind of did the Little House on the Prairie thing to her diary. And so inadvertently, they inserted some inaccuracies and some anachronisms. But for the most part, this is really a good book as far as information on the trail, and specifically life here in 1857 to 1859. Another thing is anything by J.R. Mead. If you're familiar with Kansas history, you've probably heard his name. Anything that he's written, he mentioned, has a lot of mentions about the trail itself. Well, over the course of time, this trail was used for about 3 decades. It was heavily used during the height of its use. Up to 13 wagon trains, not wagons, wagon trains would cross the Walnut during the busy time in the spring. And each one of those wagon trains would have up to 700 head of cattle. So, I mean, we're talking about this was the interstate of its day during the bulk of its use, its heaviest use. Well, to give you a little bit of context, obviously in the early 1800s, these states were not there. This is just to give you a little bit of perspective. In 1800, this area was inhabited by the nomadic tribes. So there was no permanent man-made structure in this area. And then things began to change. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, that life began to change. Missouri was open to white settlement. Kansas was not. Kansas was open to military use. So there were the military forts that were established, Fort Leavenworth and then Fort Scott. Then later on down in Indian Territory, there was Fort Gibson and then Fort Smith in Arkansas. And so there was a military road that ran on the east side of Kansas right up against the Missouri border. But Kansas was not open to white settlement. It was open to through traffic. And so in 1821, you can see there the green line, that's when William Bicknell made the first trip down into Santa Fe over that route, which eventually became known as the Santa Fe Trail. Well, and then in the 1840s, then Oregon and California became open to white settlement. And so they started the same route. What would have been typical was the people coming from the east would have gone as far west as they could by train, and then they would have gone by riverboat over the Missouri River, and they would have landed in what is now the greater Kansas City area, Independence, Westport. And so that was kind of the jumping off point for the people heading to California or Oregon. Well, January 24, 1848, gold was found at Sutter's Mill. It did, obviously, from the west coast to the east coast. It took a while for news to get back, but that winter of 48, 49, people are making their plans in the east. We are going to head over what was then an immigrant route and head west and get our gold. But there's another group of people. These were the Cherokee down in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. And they had actually been pushed out of Georgia specifically because gold had been found there. And so they had experienced mining gold, and they said, why don't we go as well? And so they got together with some people from Fort Smith and started making their plans. And what would have been probably the more anticipated route would have been that they would have head north toward this military trail, and then head north to where they would encounter the typical California trail. But instead, somewhere along the line, they got to thinking instead, we know about the Santa Fe Trail. We know where it leads. We know that if we just take off and head out northwest, we will eventually run into the Santa Fe Trail. The Santa Fe Trail runs along the Arkansas River. We know that that will take us to the Rockies. They knew that there had been travel on the east side of the Rockies. So they put this all together and they say, if we go this route and then head north, we will eventually run into the more traditional California Trail. And so that is indeed what this group did. They left. They had a group of about 40 wagons all together. They followed between the Verdigris and the Caney Rivers. They would have entered what is present-day Kansas, about where Coffeyville is now. And then they ended up on the Hickory Creek on May 8th. That's just southeast of town here. And then the following evening, they camped on the Walnut, and this little red circle shows that is where the crossing was. For many years, that was well used and well known even for later years. Then the following night, they camped at the Whitewater River. This is just northwest of Potwin. The map that I showed you earlier actually was a plat of where Potwin is. So they reached May 10, they reached the Whitewater River, and then they continued on, and they did hit the Santa Fe Trail, and then they did eventually make it to California in October. And they considered it a very successful journey. And so they sent back news that this was a good route to take. But even before they had gotten to California, there was another man who was really promoting this trail, and that was a man by the name of Lieutenant Abraham Buford. He had been down in Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. He had gone to Santa Fe in the fall of 1848 with his troops. And so now in the summer of 1849, he and his troops are returning to Fort Gibson by way of the Santa Fe Trail. And they come across this recently blazed trail heading to the southeast, which is a much more direct route for where they're wanting to head. And so they decided to head down that way. And when they reached Fort Gibson, Buford was so impressed with this trip, the trail, how it had saved him so much time. The traveling had been well. There was good watering along the way. And so he wrote to the newspapers in Fort Smith and encouraged the people, if you're going to go to California next spring, this is the route that you want to go. Well, as I said, this trail was used very heavily for 30 years. And over the course of the time, the use changed significantly. That first year, obviously, it was blazed as a trail for those going to seek gold in California. And then over the next few years, both on this trail and then the other trails as well, the number of gold seekers declined. And the reason for this was that first winter of 48, 49, as everybody's anticipating going to California and making their fortune, they have this concept that you're going to go out there and just pick up these big chunks of gold off the ground. And when the miners actually got to California, they realized it's not that easy. It's actually hard work. It's somewhat dangerous. And more significantly, what they had not anticipated is when you take a large group of people and you place them in another place where there's not a large group of supplies, supply and demand meant that the cost of just their basic needs was really exorbitant. And so even though they were finding gold and they were making what they would have considered was good money, at the end of the day, they usually did not have all that much to show for their labors. And so then as the next few years, the number of gold seekers declined, there was a new group of people traveling over this trail, and this was the merchants, because some of the people said, hey, if I can take a wagon train full of supplies and goods and freight them to California, I can sell them at this hyper-inflated prices and forget looking for gold. I'll make my fortune this way. So that was the second group of people traveling over this trail and then the other trails to California as well. And then along with the merchants were the drovers, because there was a big demand for beef, not only for human consumption, but also people are realizing this population growth is going to be permanent. We want to build up some herds here. And so that was the third group. And then for a short time, the military used this trail as well. Before long, they're just developing more and more direct routes, so they did not use it that long, but the military did use this trail for a while. And as I said, it was used so heavily. And by 1857, there were the reports of these large wagon trains with just up to 1,000 head of cattle sometimes crossing the Walnut. Well, of the groups that traveled this trail, the most well-known is probably the Baker-Fancher Party. That name may or may not ring a bell, depending on how much you love history, how well you paid attention in high school. But Alexander Fancher was from Benton County, Arkansas. That little red rectangle there is Benton County. And so in 1857, he is planning to go to California as an immigrant. He had actually gone in 1850. So he was one of those very first ones early on who had been drovers. He drove a herd of cattle to California. That time, he had actually taken the more anticipated trail as far as heading to the military trail, going north until he encountered the typical California trail and then headed west. But in 1857, this is 7 years later now, he's going to go again, but he's going as an immigrant. So he's taking his family, his wife, and they have 9 children. And along with him, his brother's family is going. Well, as was typical during that time, a wagon train might take off, and maybe a family group or a particular wagon group within the wagon train may decide, you know, this captain just isn't going fast enough. Or they may say the captain is going too fast. They're going to wear down the livestock. Or maybe there's just a personality difference. And so it's very common that different groups, early on, the different groups would join or leave a particular wagon train. And that's what happened with this group. It eventually came to be about 140 people, 120 to 150 people, something like that. Altogether, they had 40 wagons. They had a few carriages, which I find interesting, several hundred head of horses and 1,000 head of cattle. We do not know when they would have been in Butler County. As far as we know, there's no surviving day-to-day diary like we have from so many of the trips. This particular group, we do not have a diary. We do know, we have records as far as when they left, different events, other people that they encountered. So we do have some record. So from when they left, we know that they would have been in Butler County sometime around the middle of May. So, you know, about this time they would have been coming through. We know that they did make it to the Santa Fe Trail. There they encountered Major John Sedgwick. Sedgwick warned them that the Comanches were on the warpath and they should either consider turning around, or if they proceed on, that they needed to do so with great caution. Well, they decided to go on, and they did continue without incident. They made it to southwest Utah in early September, and they camped at the Mountain Meadows. Ahead of them, they're facing a hard 2-day crossing of desert. This was very common in the trails, and so what they would do to prepare for this is they would lay by for a few days. The men would go and fill up every container that they could with water. The women would bake food ahead of time, and the children would be sent out to gather up grass and cut grass, in which they'd put it in the wagon, and then that's what they would feed the animals then as they did this hard desert crossing. And obviously the animals would be allowed to rest and graze just as much as they could, because the goal is that once you take out, you want to hit this crossing just as hard and as quickly as you can and get through it to the other side where there's water and grass again. So this is what this group is doing. They're camped there at Mountain Meadows early September, and the next morning, very early, up out of the ravines comes a bunch of Indians, and they fell under attack. Well, before long, they realized these are really not Indians. They are Mormons who had disguised themselves as Indians. And so right away, they circled the wagons to defend themselves. Almost immediately, 2 of the men were killed within this wagon train group. And after a short battle, then it kind of just turned into a little bit of skirmishing and a siege. And so by Friday, September 11, the wagon train is now in a desperate situation because the men are almost out of ammunition. But they have a worse problem. They are totally out of water. The children are begging for water. And so a man comes up from the group, and he's waving a white flag, and he says, here's the deal. These Indians have agreed to take you as prisoners to this nearby city. They will load you, the women, children up in the wagon. They'll have the men walk behind, and all they ask is they do want the men to lay down their arms as a sign of good faith. Well, the men at this point really don't have much of an option. And so they agree to do this. The women and children are loaded up in the wagon. The men are lined up behind, and the order is given to proceed. And so the wagons take out, and the men are walking behind, and almost immediately following that, a second order is given, and that is to shoot. And what followed is now known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Of this over 120 people, only 17 of the very youngest children were allowed to live. The assumption is that they assumed that they would not be able to tell what had happened. Of the Fancher children, the two youngest were allowed to live. There's a 2-year-old girl, Tryphenia, and then there was a 6-year-old boy named Christopher. And this is a picture of him later on as an adult. And there had just been a lot of tension growing between the Mormons and the United States government. The United States saw that area as under their control. The Mormons saw them as an independent country. And so there had been some real friction as far as who's going to determine what traffic can come through, who there are other issues as well. And then to make matters worse, just right before this particular group from Arkansas had come through, there had been a Mormon down in Arkansas who had been murdered. And so that evidently was what triggered this specific tragedy. Needless to say, the United States government did not respond very kindly, and what ensued was a year-long war then between the Mormons and the United States government. Whitewater City and the Pearl Boom. By 1857, this was the year that the Fanchers came through, but there's now a new group of people out on the trail in this area. And these are the town builders. And again, just to give you a little bit of context, 1854 was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Kansas is now open to settlement. And within those first few years, just because of the nature of the way things were coming across the Missouri over the Missouri River, the population tended to be up by Fort Leavenworth in the Kansas City, today Kansas City, Kansas area. And then each year, the towns and settlements moved further south and further west. So by 1857, they're now in this area. Now, if this map looks a little bit strange to you, otherwise, if you're familiar with the Butler County map, it should look strange. It's because in that time, the names and the borders of the counties were being changed, if not every year, not every other year. And so that does look very strange. Also, this is an 1859 map, so Towanda should not be here in 1857. It was actually founded in 1858. Whitewater City was established at the crossing of the Whitewater there on the Cherokee Trail, just on the on the east side of the Whitewater River. The original city of El Dorado was established at the crossing here at the Walnut on the west side of the Walnut. Chelsea was established just a little bit further north west. If you're familiar with Chelsea, you know it's under the lake now. But anyway, it was established on the trail between Emporia. So the people coming down from Emporia would have traveled that way. It was a very new trail at that point. So those were the 3 towns that were established in 57. Well, in 1859, Horace Greeley came to Kansas, and he stated that in Kansas, it only takes 3 log cabins to make a city. But they start calling it a city just as soon as they have the lots staked out. And the truth of the matter is that really was not an exaggeration. That's pretty accurate as far as how Kansas was. And again, the context, this was bleeding Kansas. You have people coming in wanting to establish either a free state or a pro-slavery town and get their friends to come. And then eventually the votes would take the state the way that they desired it to go. So that was one motivation for the town building. But probably more common was just the whole financial goal. Because if you could get some land cheap from the government and then turn around and sell the lots, and your town was established and grew and you're able to sell a lot of lots, you could become very wealthy. And so during that era, there were just towns being platted and established everywhere. Well, as I said, Towanda was established in 1858, the following year after these other 3. And one of the men coming to Towanda had actually had experience working with pearls. And so when he came to the Whitewater River, he noticed there's some clams in there, and those look kind of what he was used to. And he opened them up, and sure enough, there's a pearl in there. And he opened more and more of them up, and he's finding lots of pearls. And he's guessing that these pearls might be worth anywhere between $1 and $10. Well, news got out, and so everybody is leaving their jobs. There's reports that the sawmill was abandoned. You just couldn't get anything cut at El Dorado because everybody there's just up and abandoned their jobs. And there's even talk in the Northeast Kansas, people are going to come down to the Whitewater and the Walnut Rivers, and it's going to be like a gold rush, only it's going to be seeking pearls, and everybody's going to get wealthy that way. Well, fortunately, somewhere along the line, somebody got the bright idea, maybe we should send one of these back and get an appraisal on it from the people who are going to be buying it. And the news came back that, well, these pearls really weren't uniformly colored, and more importantly, they weren't uniformly shaped. And so the appraisal of those pearls was that they were worth nothing. And so even more abruptly than the pearl boom had started, it was over. As far as Whitewater City, this again is the same plat map I showed you earlier. That is the road to California. This trail went by many names. A lot of it, what it was being used by and who it was being used by tended to change the name that they would call it. But the road to California there, is the Cherokee Trail that we're talking about. And so that shows there where it crosses the Whitewater. And during this time when the towns and just the settlement was just so booming, oftentimes the settlers would arrive in an area before the surveyors had. And so when the surveyors came, if there were dwellings that had been built or if there were crops planted, then they would mark these on these GLO survey maps. And so this is what we see here, that little red rectangle there. I don't know if you can see the two black squares, but that is the prestigious town in 1857 of Whitewater City, consisting of 2 buildings. Well, a year later, an editor from the Emporian newspaper came down, and that was very common. They would come and go to the new settlements and then do write-ups, which would help the immigrants as they come in and determine where they want to settle. And so one of the editors came to this area, and he reported that Whitewater City consisted of 2 dwellings. One was owned by a family, and then the other was owned by the town association. So in the course of a year or so, Whitewater City had not grown beyond the 2 buildings. Later histories of Butler County tell that Whitewater City at some point did consist of several buildings. So I guess it did grow somewhat. It was abandoned during the Civil War, and then afterwards it was never re-inhabited. And even though that sounds like a very sad ending, that was very typical for most of the towns that were established or tried to be established during that era. The Wild West in Butler County. When we think of Kansas and the Wild West, we think of Dodge City, right? But you have to realize that for 10 years, about approximately a decade, this was as far west as the settlement movement was halted by the Civil War. And so for a long time, this area was the frontier. There was no legal system. This was the frontier. And as you can imagine, there were events that did happen. And there's one specific event that we do have quite a bit of information on. This particular map actually is an 1885 map. So the second El Dorado, obviously where we are now, is shown up there in the right-hand corner. That was not there at this time. But the red rectangle shows you where the original El Dorado was platted. By now, El Dorado has grown into the original area. And as I said, that's pretty much the area where the refinery is now. Well, when the town association group came to the Walnut and said, okay, this is where we're going to build our city, this is where they platted the original El Dorado. They were very ambitious. That's a half a section that they planned for their city. Needless to say, it never got that big. Also, when they came here in 1857, there was already one man living. He was not in the area that had been platted for the town. He was right close to the crossing. And this cabin actually is just out on the grounds of the museum here. To me, that's an incredible thing that somebody had the foresight to save this cabin. It is the oldest building in Butler County. Well, this individual who was living in this cabin, his name was William Hildebrand. He went by Hildy. And the people who came to establish El Dorado soon realized that this is a man who doesn't mind operating on the wrong side of the law. Now, again, by 1857, when this group has come to establish this town, this is an interstate by now. So there's all sorts of traffic coming through this area, which is part of the reason why they decided to put their town here. And so the following year, they've been here about a year, and in the May of 1858, one morning a wagon train had come through and they've taken off, and Hildy is missing. And he's gone along with this wagon train. And along with him, he took 2 head of oxen. And the problem with this is they were not his animals. They belonged to Samuel Stewart. Samuel was one of the founders of the original El Dorado. Again, the book that I mentioned earlier, Augusta's Journal, Samuel was Augusta's father. And so he right away put 2 and 2 together. He could figure this out. Hildy's missing, my oxen are missing. And as was typical, they would, like as the first group that came through, they camped on the Hickory, they camped on the Walnut, and they camped on the Whitewater. Those were a good day's journey for a wagon train. And so those were pretty much the common camping spots as you would come through the trail. And so Samuel Stewart said, I think I know where my oxen are. And so he and a hired hand, Jerry Jordan, took off north along the trail, and they came to the Whitewater River, and sure enough, they found the wagon train camped there. So they go into the camp trying to locate Hildy. Unfortunately, Hildy found Jerry Jordan first, came up behind him, grabbed him in a chokehold. He grabs his gun. It looks like Jerry's life is about ready to end, but fortunately, somebody else saw what was happening, knocked the gun out of Hildy's hand, and the men in the wagon train worked together to subdue Hildy. And again, there is no legal system here, so Western justice was applied. They gave Hildy a good horsewhipping. They thought, okay, now he'll learn his lesson and decide to make himself of a better character. Unfortunately, this was not the case. The following year, Samuel Stewart's favorite pony went missing. Samuel started asking around and talked to some witnesses, and they had seen this pony being led southeast along the Cherokee Trail down into Indian Territory. And so Samuel Stewart and another man headed south along the trail. And after a week, they hadn't returned. They're starting to get concerned. They're not coming back. And then finally, someone does come up from Indian Territory, and he informs the people of El Dorado that these 2 men, these individuals, had been killed. They knew the name of the man who had actually done it, and he had connections to Hildy. At that point, the men of El Dorado suggested to Hildy that it might be better for his health if he left the community, and Hildy wisely agreed and has not been seen since. So again, this is just one incident. It's amazing. You could probably talk an hour on this specific incident. There's an awful lot of information recorded on this, both in the newspapers and Augusta's book. Local histories written after the fact, but this is a very well recorded incident. But I think there are probably a whole lot more that we just haven't uncovered yet when you realize that this really was the frontier for a long time. The Kansas Gold Rush, and you may be raising your eyebrows at that. But indeed, it actually was the Kansas Gold Rush. It was not the Colorado Gold Rush. Kansas was still a territory in 1858. And the border went way past the Rocky Mountains. In the time between 1849, when the first gold seekers went to California, and those coming from the south would have come along on the east side of the Rockies. That was the route of the Cherokee Trail near the Rockies. And so these people who were traveling back and forth, they might just go to the river to get water. And as they pulled up their basin of water, they'd realize there's gold flakes in here. Or some of them actually just found a really small gold nugget. There were others who had more experience mining. And so as they came past the mountains, they would look and think, this looks like a place where there might be gold. And so there was a lot of rumors, a lot of talk over the course of nearly a decade. But in 1858, there were several groups that went to the area of the Rockies specifically to seek gold more actively. Several of these had either they were from the south or they had connections to the south, but they struck it rich. And so the news was out, gold is in Kansas, gold is in Kansas. One of the men who was successful with seeking the gold was a man by the name of Hickory Rogers, and he wrote back to his father in Arkansas. He said, those who are mining are making between $5 and $10 a day, And I think you'd do well to start some of the boys out with a good outfit. Well, Hickory was the son of John Rogers. John Rogers is known as the founder of Fort Smith, Arkansas. Fort Smith, again, was established very early in the 1800s as a military fort, and then he was very influential in getting the city, that there was a civilian settlement that came up alongside, and so he was promoted and just helped get that platted and established as a city. So he's as the father of, of Fort Smith. So during this time now, we've had the continued immigration from California south. They would be coming through this area. And now the gold seekers are increasing again. In May of 1859, Augustus Stewart wrote in her diary that over 100 wagons a day were crossing the Walnut. So again, this was a very busy interstate. There's still the continued immigration. In 1860, there was a man who came through with his family. He kept a very meticulous diary. He wrote that on May 20, that they crossed the Walnut. And they had actually, again, as I said, the Walnut is usually a place where they would camp, but for his group arrived early in the day. He talked to the people here at El Dorado, which would have been right close to the crossing, and they said, well, if you go up a couple miles, you will find a spring there. And I don't know if you can see how well you can see where that red circle, what it says. This is again an 1885 map, so it's got the second El Dorado there, so just ignore what's up there in the right-hand corner. It does show you this spring, and it is called Cave Springs. Does that ring a bell? That is where we camped for the night, right there. Early the next morning, unfortunately, a storm came up. It knocked the wagons about, and all the livestock were scattered. So it took them several days to get the livestock gathered up. But then by the 24th, they were camped at the Whitewater, and then they proceeded on. Well, 2 days later, tragedy struck. Sadly, this was not an uncommon event, but they had a 6-year-old girl by the name of Livonia. She was in the front of the wagon. She evidently was peering out or peering over. You know how children are, they're so curious. She fell out of the wagon. First the front wheel, and then the back wheel ran over her. And her father, Philander, wrote in his diary that her leg was severely bruised and that her thigh bone was broken. He said that he said it as best they could, and then they went on. You know, life was hard in the 1800s, and on the trails, it was much harder, but they went on. So he wrote 2 weeks later in their journey, on their journey, he wrote in his diary that they had to lay by for one day on account of illness, but it was not Livonia, it was his wife. He added, she increased our family by one with the birth of a daughter, and they named this little girl Rosetta. Unfortunately, the family did make it to California. Unfortunately, the following year, little Rosetta died as an infant in California. Rosetta died. As far as Livonia, I have not found anything. Did she walk with the limp? Was she completely healed? I did find that she married and then did move to Oregon, and she died in Oregon as an older lady at the age of 82. So evidently there sometimes broken bones were fatal during that time period, but she seemed to do okay. So also in 1860, there's also more of a surge of immigration to this area. 1857 was the time when these towns were first platted, but it just took a while for people to come. And so now in 1860, there's a new surge, and these people are coming with great anticipation because the government's going to give them free land. They come, they're bringing their seeds, they're going to plant their seeds in the spring, they're going to harvest them in the fall, and that's what they're going to have to get through the winter. And if you know a farmer, you know that they're always optimistic, right? Well, they're very optimistic and coming. This was the wrong year to come to Kansas because 1860 was the driest record ever for Kansas. It's recorded in many, many places that for 12 months there was no measurable rain. And that is hard for me to imagine. I've seen a lot of big cracks, I've seen a lot of dry times, but that's hard to imagine. And so needless to say, most of these people who had come here to immigrate in 1860 just had to go back east. It was hard back east, but it was harder here. Of the families that were able to stay, probably the fact that they had been here a few years, most of those that stayed had been here longer, so they probably had more reserves. But even then, they were able to stay because much relief was sent back east during this time. So February 1861, they finally get moisture in the form of snow. Unfortunately, it's a 2-foot deep snow. And so what little the animals and livestock had been able to graze, they couldn't even reach down to that. So things were very, very dire. But again, the optimism of the farmer, it's starting to rain now. Spring has come and it's raining. The grass is greening up and things look good. You know, about April of 1861, the Civil War came. And I did mention to some, I'll try and keep this really short. I'm really trying to keep this to an hour. I mentioned to some of the people earlier, during this time, things just happened so fast. Oklahoma, we had forts down in there. They were abandoned. And so the people coming up, they basically are heading to Fort Leavenworth. They came through this area. They camped on the Walnut River 165 years ago today. So I had to go down there and take pictures. But anyway, so this is just a time of real upheaval. They don't know what's happening. Oklahoma, it's Indian Territory. The Cherokee are having their own civil war. Are they going to support the Confederacy or the United States? It's just a real mess. And so Butler County, this present-day Butler County, is almost abandoned because of the drought. And now many of the husbands and fathers are joining the Union Army. This would leave the women, they're almost destitute. They would be unprotected both from the Confederates and the Indians. And so this area was pretty much abandoned except for some mostly single men. And they stayed, they formed a militia to help protect the developments and the claims. Well, needless to say, with the situation where it is, Arkansas is seceded. There's no reason to go to Fort Smith. El Dorado is pretty much abandoned. There was to be no traffic along the trail. And so in early October of 1861, someone's out by the Whitewater Crossing, and they see that there is this wagon train and it's heading southeast. And so they go and they alert the militia and they all gather them around, hoping to make it to the Walnut River and stop this wagon train before they cross the Walnut. Well, they did not get there in time, and so they fully expected the next stopping place will be the Hickory Creek. And so they go there, and now it's night, and they circle around this wagon train and they tell them to give up lay down their arms, which they did. This is a picture of J.D. Connor. He was a member of the militia. Later, he joined the regular army, and this is a picture of him in his uniform later on. And in later life, he recounts this event, and he says if they had shown fight, we would have fared badly. 3 years' experience later convinced some of us that it had been an awkward job. Well, even though this was early October, it was a very cold night, and it was also rainy. And so these men are out guarding these prisoners, this wagon train out in the rain. The members who recorded this event later on, they say how miserable they were. And to make things worse, 2 of the prisoners escape in the middle of the night. And they don't know. Again, this is a time of just so much upheaval. Things are changing so fast, they just don't know. Are the Confederates down the Cherokee Trail just 5 miles? Will we in turn be encircled and captured and taken prisoners ourselves? And so when the sun came up, they were elated, made it through the night, and they're going to turn this wagon train over to the military. And again, this is another thing. I could talk an hour on just this specific event. I'll try and keep it short. But basically, they're going to turn it over to the military. Before they did, they wanted to rest the animals. And so this is, I don't know if you're familiar with these, but this is an aerial photo of the lake area, pre-lake era. This is the oxbows up there by the lake, and they recorded that they had built a makeshift fort in one of the oxbows, and they say that it was on James Teeter's farm, which in the later's plat, that's where that circle is. That's James Teeter's farm. They said it was just north of there. So in that oxbow, they had taken and barricaded with just a bunch of logs, and so this is where they had taken this wagon train to rest the animals. And that's a present day Google view. I don't know if that helps. I'll go back. And so that kind of shows you there in that park area where this train would have been taken. So it's turned over to the military. And right away they have a problem because the captain again, this is the era of the bushwhackers and the jayhawkers, and everybody's thieving everything, and you don't know what's legit. Jim Lang goes into Missouri and he frees slaves, but he also freed a grand piano that he happened to like. So yeah, and this was our first U.S. senator. So yeah, Kansas was a mess. Anyway, so this captain says, wait a minute, I am loyal to the Union. I am not a Confederate, and I want my wagon back. And so William F. Cloud, who was in charge, they had a military court of inquiry. He's in charge of this, and he doesn't know what to do because you can't just confiscate something, possessions, if there's no cause to. But there's also another issue because this particular captain that he knew, this man was known well. His name was Hickory Rogers, and people knew that he was from Fort Smith, Arkansas. They knew that his father, John Smith, was the founder of Fort Smith, Arkansas. Hickory's wife was down in Fort Smith, Arkansas. In fact, she gave birth to a daughter just a month after this. Hickory's father, John, had actually passed away in the previous fall of 1860, and Hickory's brother, Buck, was in the Confederate cavalry. So things, and why is he even heading south on this trail? There's nothing there but the Confederacy. So even though he is professing his innocence, it doesn't look very good. Well, in the end, the three men of this court decided that they would set the men free, that they would give the wagon back, but that these men would have to put up a bond in case the decision was adverse. Personally, I'm guessing that these men, when they were set free, that they probably just made it to Arkansas as quickly as they could and didn't worry about the wagon. Because just a few months later, Hickory was fighting with the 35th Arkansas for the Confederacy at the Battle of Pea Ridge. So I don't think his intentions were maybe as good as what he was trying to present them to be. Well, after the war, now the settlers are coming in again. At first, it's slower, and then by the 1870s, then it really picked up. I had been curious for a long time, why was there the South El Dorado, and then after the war, there's the North El Dorado? Well, as often happens when you're trying to research something, you can't find it, and when you're researching something else, you'll stumble across the answer to a question. And this is what happened in this particular case. I have only found this one article, and so you have to take it what it is. This was written by one of Jerry Connor's daughters years after the fact, but she says, this is a story that she relates, is after the war, a man by the name of John Martin came to Jerry Connor. Again, he owned the land that Hildebrand had, and so it wasn't in the El Dorado proper, but he had some buildings there. He returned to his buildings, and a man by John Martin, name of John Martin, came to there, and he says, I want to rent your building. And J.D. Connor said, no, thank you. And the reason for this was Martin wanted to rent it for a saloon, and J.D. Connor was opposed to that. And so Martin was able to locate another building a few miles to the north, which he was able to rent out. And then as more people were establishing businesses, they tended to be where this business had already been established. So that is the story that is, as it is told by J.D. Connor's daughter. That is why there was the El Dorado was then moved to the northern location. And again, by 68 and 69, there were the two different plats of the original El Dorado to the south. And then in subsequent years, El Dorado just took off, booming. As far as the rest of Butler County, in the 1870s was just the time of where Butler County just exploded as far as population. In 1876, there was a particular group of people. They're actually celebrating their 150th, Ralph. Okay, the Mennonites came to this area, and they came expressly for the purpose that they had a religious conviction against participating in war. And so here in the United States, all they had to do was sign a document affirming that they were religiously opposed to participating in war. And so they took off down to El Dorado, head down on the Cherokee Trail to the southeast, and they're going to come to El Dorado to sign this paper. Well, of the 6 men, they lived in the present-day Elbing area, and of those 6 men, they all signed it. 4 headed back to their homes. 2 of them were brothers, John and Peter Dick, aged 23 and 24. And so they signed that, and then they're going to go get lumber. So they got their lumber, and then they headed back to the Whitewater River. As they approached the river, they realized there's a storm brewing. And so they went to a neighbor by the home of a man by the name of Charles or C.V. Kane. This was common. They spent the night there. The storm didn't come. And so then they went ahead and took off early the next morning. Well, later that morning, a man by the name of I.M. Bond came to the river and he heard horses. And he realized they're trying to get up the bank. They're still hitched to the wagon. So he helps him out. He's looking around and not finding anybody. They send out a search party. When Charles Kane heard about this, he knew exactly who these individuals were, and they did eventually find the bodies of Peter 400 yards below where they had tried to cross, and then John 200 yards below that. And so that was a very tragic incident. But again, if you're familiar with the era of the trails, drownings were just very, very common. This wasn't a rare incident, sadly. Well, the trail's demise, as I said, it was really only used for 30 years. In time, as the settlers came in, originally, as you can imagine, you're used to seeing the Walmarts are all located near the interstate, right? That's very convenient. And so when these settlers came in, it was considered a plus if you're located on or near the trail. And this is an advertisement for Whitewater Bottom Ground, and it's advertising that it's on the trail. They call it the Wagon Road from Fort Smith to California. Again, just another name, same trail. And so they're advertising that. And so that was seen as a boon. But as more and more settlers came in, it wasn't really quite the advantage, because who wants all this traffic coming through their land? And then probably more importantly is who wants their neighbors' livestock grazing on your grass? And so more and more of this land was being fenced in, and that would cause the traffic to be diverted to the section lines. And so over time, the trail is being either fenced in and not used. Some of it's being farmed over, and basically it's just becoming less and less both use and well-known. This is actually, again, this is an 1885 map, but this shows you even that late. This is a remnant of the Cherokee Trail there by Leon, and it shows you where the trail, evidently these people had not fenced in their land. So it was still used in that part as late as 1885, but it was just becoming less and less used as people fenced it in. Another thing that was very significant is not only are we losing the physical signs of the trail during this time, but also this older settlers who had come, the ones who had first traveled on the trail, they're dying off. And so it's just getting where people are remembering it less and less. And as I said, for 100 years, this trail had pretty much been forgotten. And now, thanks to people like the Fletchers, it is being brought back to people's memory. And it's just a very interesting story. In 1889, an El Dorado Republican newspaper article stated, as reminiscing, many times in the past 20 years have we sat down beside this silent highway and tried to picture in our mind a realistic scene of this ancient thoroughfare, the manner of men and women, the caravans, what distant states they came from, and who, if anyone living, could write a graphic history of that early pioneer time, and how intensely interesting it would be. And I agree completely. You know, it's been decades since a century since anyone living had actually had experience on this trail. But I'm very thankful for the many resources that we have, whether it's the physical books, the online, Sonia's nodding, the online resources, the newspapers, the government documents that are available online. And from those, then we can get a glimpse of the interesting stories that happened along the Cherokee Trail. Do you have words? Oh, I'm done, unless I don't know where I am on time. I'm probably 10 minutes over already, but oh, really? Oh, you're kidding. Okay. Oh, well, I didn't know if you're shutting me down because I was way over my hour. Okay. So I don't know. You want to open it to questions? Anybody have questions? I can try to answer them if anyone has questions. Okay. People get here.
We lived at 8 Southeast 20th, and our home is probably one of the oldest ones in El Dorado. We have people stopping by all the time wanting to see our home. And we want the sign on our property that this is the Cherokee Trail. or where that.
Yeah, and so you're south of the crossing, but not to the Hickory Creek, correct? Yeah, yes, yes. No, I haven't been there with your tours. I know you've done that occasionally, but no, I'm aware of it.
And then the crossing is a little bit difficult to get to. Have you been there?
I have not.
Okay.
I know it's private property.
And he has alarms along the street that tells you when you're on his property.
I understand.
If you will call him or just walk over there and tell them that you would really like to see it. Is he here today? He might be here today. But anyway, it's just a feeling of awe to know that those wagon trains came through that creek there.
Yeah.
Any others?
It's interesting in the fact you mentioned the Meadows Mountain Massacre. Are you aware of the monument that Harrison, Arkansas contributes to those pioneers?
No, in Harrison. Okay, no.
I can't substantiate this, but I was told by my grandmother that my grandfather had two brothers in Colorado that initially started lead them out of Carroll County, Arkansas there on that, and then they left Colorado. But on that monument, it lists kids that tells about that massacre. And Kid Carson was one of the kids that was kidnapped and finally found by the army. Or at least some of the gives of the names of some of the people. And it also states about the Mormons and the army, and the army did go after the leaders of that. Were trying to come for the atrocity to those settlers. But it's right on the courthouse of Harrison, Arkansas.
Well, okay, very good. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah,
everyone
yeah.
for coming and enjoying, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
I can't believe you did this. Oh, yes, please.